The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when the ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled with an unnatural violence. She was checking the perimeter of the remote military outpost, her boots crunching against the frozen earth as she made her routine patrol. The silence of the mountain base had always been comforting to her, but today it felt different, charged with an electricity that made her skin crawl. General Morrison had been acting strangely for the past 3 days. The decorated war hero who had led countless successful missions seemed distracted, almost paranoid. He had been receiving encrypted communications at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones to unknown contacts, and canceling scheduled briefings without explanation. Sarah, his trusted aide and communications officer, had noticed everything but said nothing. In the military, you learned when to ask questions and when to simply observe. The base housed only 12 personnel, a skeleton crew maintaining critical surveillance equipment that monitored enemy activity across the border. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, a chance for seasoned soldiers to wind down from more dangerous postings. The facility sat nestled in a valley between 2 peaks, invisible to satellites and accessible only by a single winding mountain road that took 4 hours to traverse. Sarah had just turned the corner of the communications building when she heard it. A low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her training kicked in immediately, and she dropped to the ground, covering her head with her hands. The sound grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the earth itself was screaming. The explosion came without warning. One moment she was lying on cold concrete, and the next, the world erupted in fire and thunder. The blast wave hit her like a giant invisible hand, lifting her body and throwing her against the metal wall of a storage shed 20 feet away. The impact knocked the air from her lungs and sent stars dancing across her vision. When the ringing in her ears finally subsided, Sarah found herself buried under chunks of concrete and twisted metal. Her left arm throbbed with pain and she could taste blood in her mouth. Slowly, carefully, she began to dig herself out of the debris, testing each limb as she moved. Nothing seemed broken, though her entire body ached as if she had been hit by a truck. The sight that greeted her when she finally stood was devastating. The main building had been completely destroyed, reduced to a smoking crater filled with rubble and burning debris. The communications tower lay twisted and broken, its metal frame scattered across the compound like the bones of some enormous beast. Thick black smoke rose into the clear mountain air, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning electronics and something else, something organic that made her stomach turn. Sarah called out for survivors, her voice hoarse and barely audible above the crackling of flames. No response came. She stumbled through the wreckage, searching desperately for any sign of life among her fellow soldiers. The barracks had been flattened, the dining hall reduced to splinters, and the motor pool had become a twisted graveyard of melted vehicles. As she searched, a terrible realization began to take shape in her mind. This had not been an accident. The explosion had been too precise, too complete. Someone had deliberately destroyed the base, and they had done it from the inside. The positioning of the blast, the way it had consumed the main building while leaving the outer structures partially intact, suggested intimate knowledge of the facility's layout. Her thoughts immediately turned to General Morrison. In the chaos following the explosion, she had not seen him among the debris. His quarters had been in the main building, the epicenter of the destruction, but somehow she felt certain he was not among the casualties. There had been something in his behavior, something in the way he had dismissed the regular evening briefing the night before, that now seemed significant. Sarah made her way to what remained of the communications center, hoping to find some way to call for help. The radio equipment had been obliterated, the computers reduced to molten slag, and the backup generators had been damaged beyond repair. She was completely cut off from the outside world, stranded in the mountains with no way to contact headquarters or request evacuation. The isolation was profound and terrifying. The nearest civilian settlement was over 50 miles away, accessible only by the mountain road that wound through treacherous terrain. In winter conditions, attempting to travel on foot would be suicide. She would have to survive here in the ruins of the base until someone came looking for them. But who would come and when? The base operated under strict communication protocols. They were required to check in with headquarters only once every 72 hours. It had been less than 24 hours since the last scheduled contact, which meant she might have to wait 2 more days before anyone even realized something was wrong. As the shock of the explosion began to wear off, Sarah's military training took over. She needed shelter, water, food, and medical supplies. She needed to treat her injuries and assess the full extent of the damage. Most importantly, she needed to figure out what had happened and why. The sun was setting by the time she had salvaged enough supplies to last several days. She had found a partially intact storage room that would provide adequate shelter, and she had managed to recover some food rations and basic medical supplies from the wreckage. Her arm was not broken, but it was badly bruised and swollen. She fashioned a makeshift sling from torn fabric and tried to ignore the constant throbbing pain. As darkness fell over the mountain, Sarah huddled in her makeshift shelter and tried to piece together the events of the day. The explosion had been no accident, of that she was certain. Someone had planted explosives in the main building. Someone with access to the facility and knowledge of its operations. The timing suggested it had been triggered remotely, perhaps by someone who wanted to ensure they were safely away before the blast occurred. General Morrison's absence from the wreckage was becoming more significant with each passing hour. Either he had been completely vaporized in the explosion, leaving no trace behind, or he had not been in the building when it happened. Given his strange behavior in recent days, Sarah was beginning to suspect the latter. The mountain night was bitter cold, and despite her military-issued sleeping bag, Sarah found it impossible to sleep. Every sound made her jump, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. She was alone in the wilderness, surrounded by the wreckage of her world, with no way to know if help was coming or if she would have to save herself. Sarah woke to the sound of helicopters in the distance. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and her injured arm had stiffened during the night, making every movement painful. She scrambled out of her makeshift shelter and looked up at the gray morning sky, searching for the source of the sound. 2 black military helicopters were approaching from the south, flying low over the mountain peaks. Relief flooded through her as she realized that help had arrived sooner than expected. Someone must have detected the explosion or noticed the smoke rising from the valley. She gathered pieces of reflective metal from the debris and began signaling the aircraft, hoping to catch the attention of the pilots. The helicopters circled the destroyed base several times before landing in the only clear area large enough to accommodate them. Colonel James Rodriguez emerged from the lead helicopter, followed by a team of soldiers and investigators. Sarah had met Rodriguez before during training exercises, and she was grateful to see a familiar face among the rescue team. He was a tall, serious man with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of a situation at once. The colonel's expression was grim as he surveyed the destruction. He approached Sarah with concern evident in his voice, asking about her injuries and the fate of the other personnel. When she confirmed that she appeared to be the only survivor, his face darkened with a mixture of anger and determination. This was not just a tragic accident, but a major security breach that had cost 11 lives. As the medical team attended to Sarah's injuries, she overheard Rodriguez speaking with his investigators. They had lost contact with the base 18 hours earlier than scheduled, which had triggered immediate concern at headquarters. General Morrison had failed to respond to urgent communications regarding a developing situation along the border, something that was completely out of character for the veteran commander. The investigation team began their work immediately, combing through the wreckage with sophisticated equipment designed to detect explosive residue and identify the cause of the blast. Within hours, their worst fears were confirmed. The explosion had been caused by military-grade plastic explosives, planted strategically throughout the main building to ensure maximum destruction. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the team's forensic specialist, explained to Sarah that the bombing showed signs of professional planning and execution. The placement of the charges had been calculated to destroy all communications equipment and eliminate any potential witnesses. It was the work of someone with extensive knowledge of demolitions and intimate familiarity with the base layout. As the investigators worked, Sarah found herself being questioned repeatedly about the events leading up to the explosion. She told them everything she could remember about General Morrison's strange behavior, his secretive communications, and his absence from the wreckage. Each detail seemed to deepen the mystery rather than provide answers. Colonel Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside as the sun reached its peak. He told her that General Morrison was not just missing, he was suspected of being involved in the destruction of the base. Intelligence reports had revealed that the general had been in contact with foreign agents for several weeks before the explosion. Financial records showed large deposits into overseas accounts linked to his identity. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. General Morrison had been her mentor, the man who had recommended her for her position at the base and who had taught her everything she knew about military communications. The idea that he could be a traitor seemed impossible to accept, yet the evidence was mounting against him. Rodriguez explained that Morrison had likely used his access and authority to plant the explosives himself, timing the detonation for when he could be safely away from the blast zone. The goal appeared to be the destruction of critical intelligence data stored at the facility, along with the elimination of anyone who might have discovered his activities. The search teams had expanded their operation beyond the immediate blast site, using thermal imaging equipment and tracking dogs to scour the surrounding mountains for any sign of the missing general. The terrain was rugged and dangerous, with deep ravines, unstable rock formations, and patches of dense forest that could hide a person for weeks. Sarah volunteered to join the search efforts. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had experienced, she knew the area better than most of the search team members, having spent months exploring the mountain trails during off-duty hours. More importantly, she understood Morrison's habits and preferences, knowledge that might prove crucial in predicting his movements. The first day of searching yielded nothing. The teams covered miles of difficult terrain, checking abandoned hunting cabins, natural cave formations, and remote camping spots where someone might take shelter. The mountain weather was unforgiving, with sudden snow squalls and bone-chilling winds that made progress slow and dangerous. On the second day, they found the first significant clue, a hiking boot print in soft earth near a stream, approximately 3 miles northeast of the base. The print was fresh, no more than 2 days old, and it matched the size and pattern of standard military-issued boots. Dr. Hayes took detailed measurements and photographs, confirming that it likely belonged to an adult male of Morrison's approximate height and weight. The discovery energized the search teams and focused their efforts on the northeastern sector of the mountain range. This area was particularly treacherous, with steep cliffs and unstable geological formations that had claimed the lives of several experienced climbers over the years. If Morrison was hiding in this region, he was either very skilled at mountain survival or very desperate. As the teams prepared for another day of searching, Sarah found herself haunted by memories of her interactions with General Morrison. She replayed conversations they had shared, looking for signs she might have missed, clues that could have warned her of his true intentions. The betrayal felt personal, not just because of the professional relationship they had shared, but because his actions had resulted in the deaths of good soldiers who had trusted him. The investigation back at the base was revealing more disturbing details about the extent of Morrison's treachery. Encrypted files recovered from damaged hard drives showed evidence of systematic intelligence gathering over several months. He had been photographing classified documents, copying communication protocols, and mapping the base's security systems in preparation for the attack. Colonel Rodriguez briefed Sarah on the broader implications of Morrison's betrayal. The intelligence he had gathered and presumably passed to foreign agents could compromise ongoing operations across the entire region. Other military installations were being placed on high alert, and several planned missions had been canceled or postponed until the full extent of the security breach could be determined. As night fell on the second day of searching, Sarah sat in the command tent studying topographical maps of the search area. She traced potential routes Morrison might have taken, considering his physical condition, his survival training, and his likely mental state. He was an experienced soldier, but he was also a man in his 50s who had spent recent years behind a desk rather than in the field. The weather forecast for the coming days was grim. A major storm system was approaching from the west, bringing with it heavy snow and dangerous wind conditions that would make searching nearly impossible. If they were going to find General Morrison, they would need to do it soon before the mountain claimed both the traitor and the secrets he carried. The storm arrived earlier than predicted, transforming the mountain landscape into a white wilderness of swirling snow and howling wind. Sarah watched from inside the command tent as visibility dropped to mere yards, making any further search operations impossible. The helicopters had been grounded, and most of the search teams had been forced to take shelter in the hastily established base camp. Colonel Rodriguez was growing increasingly frustrated with the delays. Intelligence reports from headquarters indicated that foreign operatives were actively seeking to make contact with General Morrison, suggesting that his escape from the mountains was part of a larger plan. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood that sensitive military secrets would fall into enemy hands. Dr. Hayes had been analyzing the evidence recovered from the blast site, and her findings painted an even more troubling picture of Morrison's betrayal. Chemical analysis of explosive residue showed that the materials used were not standard military ordnance, but rather specialized demolition charges typically used in covert operations. This suggested that Morrison had been working with a sophisticated enemy network for some time. Sarah had been studying Morrison's personnel file, trying to understand how a decorated war hero had become a traitor. His record was exemplary, spanning over 25 years of distinguished service. He had received numerous commendations for bravery, leadership, and dedication to duty. There were no obvious red flags, no indications of financial problems or personal troubles that might have made him vulnerable to foreign recruitment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining Morrison's personal effects, recovered from his quarters, investigators found a hidden compartment in his desk, containing a small journal written in code. The cipher was complex but not unbreakable, and military cryptographers working around the clock managed to decode several key passages. The journal revealed that Morrison's betrayal had begun almost a year earlier, following the death of his son in a military operation that had gone wrong. The young soldier had been killed due to faulty intelligence, and Morrison had blamed the military command structure for the tragedy. His grief and anger had made him receptive to approaches from foreign agents who promised revenge against the system he felt had betrayed his family. Reading the decoded entries, Sarah began to understand the depth of Morrison's psychological transformation. What had started as a desire for revenge had evolved into a complex web of financial incentives and ideological manipulation. The foreign agents had skillfully exploited his emotional vulnerability, gradually turning him against everything he had once sworn to protect. As the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She requested permission to continue the search on foot, alone, using her knowledge of Morrison's psychology and her familiarity with the mountain terrain. Colonel Rodriguez initially refused, citing the dangerous weather conditions and her recent injuries, but Sarah's persistence eventually wore down his resistance. She argued that Morrison would not have chosen his hiding place randomly. His military training and current mental state would influence his decisions in predictable ways. He would seek shelter that provided both concealment and escape routes, somewhere defensible but not too isolated, to prevent eventual extraction by his handlers. She believed she knew where he might be hiding. Equipped with cold weather gear, emergency supplies, and a GPS tracking device, Sarah set out into the storm. The wind cut through her protective clothing like knives, and the snow made every step treacherous. She followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains, toward a series of natural caves she had explored during her time at the base. The caves were located in a remote valley, accessible only by a difficult climb through rocky terrain that most searchers would have avoided. Morrison would have remembered her mentioning these caves during casual conversations about hiking and exploration. If he was thinking clearly, he might have realized that she would eventually remember them too. Progress was painfully slow in the storm conditions. Sarah had to stop frequently to check her navigation equipment and ensure she was staying on the correct path. The cold was becoming dangerous, penetrating her clothing and making her fingers numb despite her insulated gloves. She began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in attempting this solo mission. After 3 hours of difficult climbing, Sarah reached the valley where the caves were located. The storm seemed less intense here, sheltered by the surrounding peaks, but visibility was still severely limited. She began systematically checking each cave entrance, looking for signs of recent occupation while being careful not to trigger any defensive measures Morrison might have prepared. The fourth cave she examined showed clear evidence of recent use. Footprints in the sandy floor matched those found earlier by the search teams, and she could see where someone had arranged rocks to create a crude windbreak near the entrance. More significantly, she detected the faint smell of a recent fire, suggesting that someone had been using the cave for warmth and cooking. Sarah approached the cave carefully, using techniques she had learned in combat training to minimize her exposure while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. She called out Morrison's name, identifying herself and attempting to establish communication. The only response was the echo of her own voice bouncing off the stone walls. Inside the cave, she found more evidence of Morrison's presence. A sleeping area had been prepared using pine branches and salvaged materials, and there were empty food containers that matched military rations. Most importantly, she discovered a small cache of documents hidden beneath loose rocks, including maps of the region with escape routes marked in red ink. The maps revealed Morrison's plan in detail. He had identified multiple extraction points where his foreign contacts could safely remove him from the mountains, each carefully chosen to avoid detection by military search teams. The nearest extraction point was located at an abandoned logging road approximately 10 miles to the north, accessible by following a series of connected ridgelines that would provide concealment from aerial surveillance. Sarah studied the maps carefully, realizing that Morrison had probably left this cave recently, possibly within the last few hours. The timing suggested that he was moving toward the extraction point during the storm, using the weather as cover to avoid detection. If she was right, there might still be time to intercept him before he reached safety. The decision to pursue Morrison alone was risky, but Sarah felt she had no choice. Radio contact with the base camp was impossible in the storm, and by the time she could return to request backup, Morrison would have had hours to extend his lead. She gathered the evidence she had found and prepared to continue the pursuit. As she left the cave, Sarah noticed fresh footprints leading away from the entrance, partially filled with snow but still clearly visible. Morrison had indeed been here recently, and he was heading north toward the extraction point, just as his maps indicated. The trail would be difficult to follow in the storm, but not impossible for someone with her training and determination. The hunt for the traitorous general was entering its most dangerous phase, with both hunter and prey struggling against the brutal mountain environment while racing against time. Sarah understood that she was not just tracking a fugitive, but pursuing answers to questions that had haunted her since the moment she pulled herself from the wreckage of the base. The confrontation, when it came, would determine not just Morrison's fate, but her own understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and the true cost of revenge. The footprints led Sarah through increasingly treacherous terrain, winding along narrow ridges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall into the valleys below. The storm was beginning to subside, but the wind still howled through the mountain passes, creating an eerie soundtrack for her solitary pursuit. She moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing her full weight, knowing that injury in this remote location would mean certain death. Morrison's trail showed signs of urgency and fatigue. His footprints were deeper and less precise than they had been near the cave, suggesting that he was pushing himself hard despite the challenging conditions. Occasionally, Sarah found places where he had slipped or stumbled, leaving scuff marks in the snow and rock that told the story of his increasingly desperate flight. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to clear, revealing the vast expanse of wilderness that surrounded them. Sarah could see for miles in every direction, a landscape of snow-covered peaks and dense forests broken only by the occasional glimpse of distant valleys. The beauty of the scene was marred by the knowledge that somewhere in this vast wilderness, a traitor was carrying secrets that could endanger countless lives. The improving visibility also meant that Sarah could see Morrison's tracks more clearly, and what she saw concerned her. His stride was becoming irregular, and there were signs that he was favoring his left leg. Either he had been injured during his escape from the base, or the difficult mountain travel was taking a greater toll than he had anticipated. A wounded and desperate man was potentially more dangerous than a healthy one. Sarah paused to rest and eat some of her emergency rations, knowing that she needed to maintain her strength for what might be a prolonged chase. As she ate, she studied Morrison's maps more carefully, trying to anticipate his next moves. The extraction point was still several miles away, but the route he had chosen would take him through a particularly dangerous section of the mountain known for its unstable rock formations and hidden crevasses. The sound of falling rocks ahead alerted Sarah to Morrison's proximity. She moved forward cautiously, using the natural cover provided by large boulders and twisted pine trees to mask her approach. As she crested a small ridge, she caught her first glimpse of the man she had been pursuing for the past day and night. General Morrison looked nothing like the confident, authoritative officer she remembered from the base. His uniform was torn and dirty, his face gaunt with exhaustion and stress. He was moving slowly, clearly favoring his left leg and stopping frequently to rest against rocks or trees. The weight of his betrayal seemed to have aged him years in just a few days. Sarah watched as Morrison consulted a handheld GPS device, confirming his position and adjusting his course slightly to the northwest. He was still following the route outlined in his maps, but his pace suggested that he would not reach the extraction point according to his original timeline. This might work to Sarah's advantage, giving her time to get ahead of him and choose the location for their inevitable confrontation. Moving parallel to Morrison's route but staying out of sight, Sarah began to look for a suitable place to intercept him. She needed terrain that would give her tactical advantages while minimizing the risk of the encounter, escalating into violence. Despite his betrayal and the deaths he had caused, Morrison was still a human being, and Sarah hoped to take him alive to face justice for his crimes. The opportunity came at a narrow passage between two rock formations, where Morrison would be forced to expose himself while climbing over a fallen tree that blocked the trail. Sarah positioned herself on higher ground, using the natural cover to remain hidden while maintaining a clear line of sight to the passage. She checked her service weapon, hoping she would not need to use it but prepared for any eventuality. When Morrison appeared at the passage, Sarah called out his name, identifying herself and ordering him to stop. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol holstered at his side. But he froze when he saw Sarah's weapon trained on him from the rocks above. The confrontation was surreal, a moment that seemed to exist outside of time and place. Here, in the wilderness of the mountains, the survivor of Morrison's betrayal faced the architect of the tragedy that had claimed 11 lives. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence broken only by the wind rustling through the pine trees and the distant cry of a mountain hawk. Morrison was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse and strained from exhaustion and emotion. He asked Sarah how she had survived the explosion, his tone suggesting both curiosity and regret. When she explained her miraculous escape and the investigation that had followed, his shoulders sagged with the weight of his guilt and the realization that his carefully planned operation had not been as successful as he had believed. The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of Morrison's psychological breakdown and the manipulation he had endured at the hands of foreign agents. He spoke of his son's death, the anger and grief that had consumed him, and the way his handlers had exploited those emotions to turn him against everything he had once held sacred. His voice broke as he described the moment when he realized that his quest for revenge had made him into the very thing he despised. Sarah listened to Morrison's confession with a mixture of anger and pity. She could see the man he had once been beneath the layers of bitterness and betrayal, but she could not forget the lives that had been lost because of his actions. Her fellow soldiers had died because of his choices, and no amount of regret or explanation could bring them back or justify what he had done. As they talked, Sarah became aware that they were not alone in the mountains. Morrison's foreign handlers had not abandoned their asset, and they were closing in on the extraction point according to their own timeline. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance confirmed her suspicions, and she realized that time was running out for both of them. Morrison heard the helicopters too, and for a moment Sarah saw hope flicker in his eyes. But then reality set in, and he understood that his handlers would not allow him to be taken alive. He knew too much, had seen too much, and his capture would expose their entire operation. The approaching aircraft represented not rescue but elimination. The situation had become a deadly race against time. Sarah needed to get Morrison to safety and into custody before his handlers could reach them, while Morrison found himself caught between the justice of his own country and the merciless efficiency of his foreign masters. The mountains that had sheltered him during his flight were about to become the arena for a final confrontation that would determine not just his fate, but the security of sensitive military information that could affect countless lives. In the distance, the sound of the helicopters grew louder, and Sarah knew that the most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. She had found the missing general, but bringing him to justice would require surviving the next few hours in a wilderness where enemies lurked behind every ridge, and death could come from the sky at any moment. The helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge like predatory birds, their dark silhouettes stark against the morning sky. Sarah counted 3 aircraft, moving in a coordinated search pattern that suggested military training and sophisticated equipment. These were not amateur operatives, but professionals sent to eliminate loose ends and protect their investment in General Morrison's betrayal. Morrison's reaction to the approaching aircraft was immediate and visceral. The color drained from his face as he realized that his foreign handlers had not come to rescue him, but to silence him permanently. He looked at Sarah with desperate eyes, understanding that his only chance of survival now lay with the very people he had betrayed. Sarah made a quick tactical assessment of their situation. The rocky terrain provided some concealment from aerial observation, but the helicopters were equipped with thermal imaging equipment that would make hiding difficult. Their best option was to reach the dense forest cover approximately half a mile to the west, where the thick canopy of pine trees might mask their heat signatures. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed Morrison's arm and pulled him toward the tree line, abandoning any pretense of arrest in favor of survival. The injured general struggled to keep pace, his damaged leg making rapid movement painful and difficult. Behind them, the sound of the helicopters grew louder as the search pattern tightened around their location. The first shots came as they reached the edge of the forest, high-velocity rounds that splintered the rocks where they had been standing moments before. The foreign operatives were not taking any chances, and their orders were clearly to eliminate both Morrison and any witnesses to his activities. Sarah pushed Morrison deeper into the woods, using the trees as cover while searching for a defensible position. They found temporary shelter in a natural depression surrounded by large boulders and fallen logs. Sarah quickly assessed their resources while Morrison caught his breath and tried to come to terms with his desperate situation. She had her service weapon with limited ammunition, basic survival gear, and a wounded man who might be more liability than asset in the coming confrontation. Morrison, despite his physical condition and emotional state, retained enough of his military training to be useful in a firefight. He checked his own weapon and confirmed that he had 2 full magazines of ammunition, along with intimate knowledge of the tactics and equipment their pursuers were likely to employ. For the first time since his capture, he seemed focused and determined rather than broken and defeated. The helicopters had landed somewhere behind them, disgorging teams of armed operatives who were now approaching through the forest on foot. Sarah could hear them moving through the underbrush, communicating with each other using hand signals and encrypted radio transmissions. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting extensive training in wilderness combat operations. As the enemy forces closed in on their position, Sarah found herself in the surreal situation of fighting alongside the man she had been sent to capture. Morrison's betrayal of his country was unforgivable, but in this moment they were united by their common need to survive against a mutual enemy. The philosophical complexities of the situation would have to wait until they lived long enough to address them. The first direct contact came when Morrison spotted movement in the trees to their north. He whispered a warning to Sarah, who carefully repositioned herself to get a better view of the approaching threat. 2 operatives were advancing through the forest using classic bounding overwatch tactics, one providing cover while the other moved forward to a new position. Sarah waited until both men were visible before engaging, knowing that surprise was their only tactical advantage against superior numbers and equipment. Her first shots were precise and effective, dropping one operative immediately and sending the other scrambling for cover behind a large tree. Morrison provided supporting fire, his own marksmanship skills still sharp despite his recent ordeal. The engagement quickly escalated as more operatives moved to flank their position from multiple directions. Sarah and Morrison found themselves fighting a running battle through the forest, using the terrain to their advantage while trying to avoid being surrounded. The enemy forces were well-equipped and professionally trained, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against opponents who knew the local geography. During a brief lull in the fighting, Morrison revealed crucial information about his handler's operation. He told Sarah about a secure communication device hidden in his backpack, programmed with frequencies and codes that could be used to intercept enemy transmissions and potentially call for backup from friendly forces. The device represented both an opportunity and a risk, as using it would reveal their location to anyone monitoring the frequencies. Sarah made the decision to activate the device, sending an encrypted distress signal to Colonel Rodriguez and the search teams back at base camp. The transmission was brief and coded, providing their approximate location and the nature of the threat they were facing. With luck, military reinforcements would arrive before the enemy forces could complete their mission. The response came sooner than expected, but not from the direction Sarah had anticipated. Instead of reinforcements from base camp, they were contacted by a different military unit that had been monitoring the situation from a remote observation post. Captain Maria Santos, leading a special operations team, confirmed that they were en route to provide assistance and would arrive within 30 minutes. The news of incoming friendly forces changed the tactical situation dramatically. Sarah and Morrison no longer needed to escape or defeat the enemy operatives. They just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. This shift in objectives allowed them to adopt more defensive tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of their pursuers while avoiding direct confrontation when possible. As they moved through the forest, Morrison continued to provide information about his handlers' methods and capabilities. He described their training, their equipment, and their typical operational procedures, intelligence that proved invaluable in predicting their movements and avoiding their search patterns. Despite his betrayal, his military expertise and local knowledge made him an invaluable ally in their fight for survival. The sound of approaching aircraft announced the arrival of Captain Santos and her special operations team. The enemy operatives, recognizing that their mission had been compromised, attempted to disengage and extract from the area. However, the special operations team was prepared for this possibility and had positioned blocking forces to prevent escape. The final phase of the engagement was brief but intense. Caught between Sarah and Morrison's defensive position and the special operations team's assault, the enemy operatives found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Some attempted to fight their way out, while others tried to surrender, but the nature of their mission and the sensitive information at stake made capture and interrogation the preferred outcome for all involved. When the shooting finally stopped, Sarah found herself alive and relatively uninjured, though exhausted from the prolonged chase and firefight. Morrison had sustained additional injuries during the engagement, but nothing life-threatening. Most importantly, several enemy operatives had been captured alive, along with equipment and intelligence materials that would provide valuable insights into foreign intelligence operations. As Captain Santos and her team secured the area and tended to the wounded, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few days. She had survived an explosion that killed 11 of her fellow soldiers, tracked a traitorous general through treacherous mountain terrain, and fought alongside her former mentor against foreign operatives seeking to eliminate them both. The experience had tested every aspect of her training and pushed her to limits she had not known existed. The morning sun broke through the forest canopy as the last of the enemy operatives were secured and prepared for transport. Sarah sat on a fallen log, watching as medics attended to General Morrison's injuries while Captain Santos coordinated the extraction of prisoners and intelligence materials. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and the promise of a new day that had seemed impossible. Just hours before, Colonel Rodriguez arrived with additional reinforcements as the cleanup operation was concluding. His relief at finding Sarah alive was evident, but it was tempered by the magnitude of the security breach they had uncovered and the complex legal and political ramifications that would follow. The capture of foreign operatives on American soil, combined with Morrison's betrayal, would trigger investigations and policy reviews that would reach the highest levels of government. Morrison was conscious but subdued as he was prepared for medical evacuation. The fight through the forest had drained the last of his physical and emotional reserves, leaving him looking older and more frail than Sarah had ever seen him. When their eyes met, she saw not the confident general who had been her mentor, but a broken man who understood the full weight of his choices and their consequences. Before the helicopters arrived to transport Morrison to a secure medical facility, he asked to speak with Sarah privately. Colonel Rodriguez initially objected, citing security concerns and the ongoing investigation, but Sarah convinced him to allow a brief conversation under close supervision. She needed to understand how the man she had respected and trusted could have fallen so far from the ideals they had both sworn to uphold. Morrison's words were halting and filled with regret as he tried to explain the psychological journey that had led him to betrayal. He spoke of the overwhelming grief that had consumed him after his son's death, the anger that had festered when he learned the true circumstances of the mission that had claimed the young soldier's life. The foreign agents had found him at his most vulnerable moment and skillfully exploited his pain, turning his grief into a weapon against his own country. Sarah listened without judgment, understanding that she was hearing the confession of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. Morrison's betrayal was inexcusable, but his humanity was still visible beneath the layers of guilt and self-recrimination. He had been a good soldier once, a good man who had served his country with honor for most of his adult life. The tragedy was not just what he had become, but what he had lost in the process of becoming it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the medical evacuation helicopters, their rotors beating against the mountain air with mechanical precision. Morrison was loaded onto a stretcher and prepared for transport to a secure facility where he would receive medical treatment before facing the military justice system. As the aircraft lifted off, Sarah watched until it disappeared over the eastern ridge, carrying with it a chapter of her life that had ended in ways she could never have imagined. The journey back to the base camp was subdued, with everyone involved in the operation processing the events of the past few days. The intelligence gathered from the captured operatives was already proving valuable, revealing the existence of a sophisticated spy network that had been operating undetected for several years. Morrison's betrayal had been just one part of a larger operation designed to compromise American military capabilities and steal sensitive, technological secrets. Dr. Hayes briefed Sarah on the preliminary findings of the investigation as they descended the mountain. The explosion at the base had been intended not just to eliminate witnesses, but to destroy a specific piece of experimental communication equipment that Morrison had been unable to steal or sabotage. The technology represented a significant advancement in secure military communications, and its loss would have set back American capabilities by several years. Back at the temporary command center, Sarah was debriefed extensively about her experiences during the pursuit and capture of General Morrison. Intelligence analysts were particularly interested in the details of Morrison's psychological state and his revelations about foreign intelligence operations. Every piece of information would be crucial in understanding the full scope of the security breach and preventing similar incidents in the future. The personal toll of the experience was something that Sarah would carry with her long after. The official investigations were complete. She had lost friends and colleagues in the explosion, survived against impossible odds, and confronted the reality that even the most trusted individuals could fall victim to manipulation and betrayal. The world seemed less secure than it had before, but also more precious because she understood how quickly everything could change. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself testifying before military tribunals and congressional committees, investigating the security failures that had allowed Morrison's betrayal to occur. Her survival and pursuit of the general had made her something of a reluctant hero, but she took no satisfaction in the attention. The real heroes, she believed, were the 11 soldiers who had died in the explosion, victims of a tragedy they could never have anticipated or prevented. General Morrison was eventually convicted of treason, espionage, and multiple counts of murder in military court. His sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a punishment that seemed both appropriate and inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. The foreign operatives captured during the forest engagement were exchanged for American prisoners held overseas, their diplomatic immunity making prosecution in American courts impossible. Sarah received a commendation for her actions during the crisis, along with a promotion and transfer to a new assignment that would make use of her unique experience with counterintelligence operations. She accepted the recognition gracefully but privately, knowing that the real measure of her success was not the medals or advancement, but the fact that she had survived to continue serving her country and protecting it from those who would do it harm. The destroyed base was eventually rebuilt, with enhanced security measures designed to prevent future infiltration and sabotage. A memorial was erected to honor the 11 soldiers who had died in the explosion, their names carved in black granite that would endure long after the memory of the tragedy had faded from public consciousness. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, standing quietly among the families and friends of the fallen, knowing that their sacrifice would never be forgotten by those who understood its true cost. As dawn broke over the rebuilt facility on the first anniversary of the explosion, Sarah stood at the memorial and reflected on the events that had changed her life so dramatically. The mountains around the base were peaceful and beautiful, showing no signs of the violence and betrayal that had once stained their slopes with blood and tragedy. The sun rising over the eastern peaks promised new beginnings and the possibility that the lessons learned from Morrison's betrayal would help protect future generations of soldiers from similar threats. The story of her survival and pursuit of General Morrison had become part of military lore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromised loyalty and the importance of remaining vigilant against internal threats. But for Sarah, it remained a deeply personal experience that had tested every aspect of her character and training, ultimately proving that even in the darkest moments of betrayal and violence, honor and duty could still triumph over corruption and despair.